planes that allegedly hit the Pentagon and in Shanksville were Boeing 757s, which have a wingspan of 125 feet. They weigh 100 tons and have a tail that stands 44 feet above the air. And yet Jamie McIntyre reported at the Pentagon that there were no indications that any plane had hit anywhere near the Pentagon. And the reporter, Kanicki, reported that there were no signs of any crash there, and the hole was rather small. What then about New York? What's going on in New York? Remember now, the NTSB had conducted no investigation because it was shown on television.
No second plane. It was a bomb. Bomb in another building, not second plane. That was a bomb. Who said the second plane?
That's what we're told. The second plane was still out on top. Wrong.
But for Evan Fairbanks, this is the image that will haunt him and us for the rest of our lives.
The image of that plane just coming out of nowhere, coming into the frame and disappearing into the south side of the tower, as if a floor had been hollowed out and it was a hangar that it was just landing in. We've seen these images in movies and we know that it's all artificial, and Hollywood makes it. And it's hard to put together that it's real this time.
But for Evan Fairbanks, this is the image that will haunt him and us for the rest of our lives.
The image of that plane just coming out of nowhere, coming into the frame and disappearing into the south side of the tower, as if a floor had been hollowed out and it was a hangar that it was just landing in. We've seen these images in movies and we know that it's all artificial, and Hollywood makes it. And it's hard to put together that it's real this time.
But for Evan Fairbanks,
one more
this
time,
is the image that will haunt him and us for the rest of our lives.
The image of that plane just coming out of nowhere, coming into the frame and disappearing into the south side of the tower, as if a floor had been hollowed out and it was a hangar that it was just landing in. We've seen these images in movies and we know that it's all artificial, and Hollywood makes it. And it's hard to put together that it's real this time.
Evan Fairbanks.
Now, what you want to observe here is the way that plane disappears into this building. Evan Fairbanks would even observe later that it was like a bad special effect. Well, the fact of the matter is that a fellow by the name of Isaac Newton postulated 3 laws of motion that have been among the most widely recognized laws of nature, which have the characteristic that they cannot be violated, they cannot be changed, and they require no enforcement. Newton's 3 laws of motion include that an object will remain at rest or in motion, in uniform motion, until it's acted upon by a force. The second law is that the object in motion or at rest will react in the direction of the imposed force. And the third law is that for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction. Now, the plane in this instance has been estimated to have a speed of 560 miles an hour, which is rather remarkable because that's the cruising speed of a Boeing 767 at 35,000 feet. But at 700 to 1,000 feet, where the air is 3 times denser, this would be a physical impossibility. John Lear, among our nation's most distinguished pilots, who is the son of the designer of the Learjet, has observed that at that altitude, the engines would function as a brake on the aircraft, and that it couldn't possibly fly at that speed, at that altitude. Plus, other aeronautical engineers have observed that it would become unmanageable, that the plane could not be controlled at that altitude. And this result has been confirmed by pilots for 9/11 Truth in their own studies of the footage of this plane hitting the building. When it comes to Newton now, the way in which his third law applies is that the effect of the plane hitting at high speed hitting the stationary building would be the same as that of the building at high speed hitting a stationary plane. What we ought to be observing would be analogous to what would happen if an automobile ran into a tree. There'd be massive collision debris everywhere. We would not expect the automobile, even if it were driving faster and faster, say 120 miles an hour as opposed to 60 miles an hour, to simply melt through the tree. That's a physical absurdity. But no less absurd is what we are seeing here before our very eyes. These buildings weigh 500,000 tons. They're constructed of steel and concrete, and the resistance they would provide to the aircraft would be enormous. I shall detail precisely what this plane was encountering when it hit the building. But bear in mind that it would be, the vector addition, the speed equivalent would be the same as if the building were going half of 560 and the plane half, just as two cars that crash, each is going 60 miles an hour, is equivalent to a 120 mile an hour crash with an inert object. So we have also noticed in this footage that the plane takes the same number of frames to pass through its own length in air as it does to pass through its own length into the building, which means that the building is providing no resistance whatsoever to the aircraft penetrating through it. So I think when Evan Fairbanks said that this was a bad special effect, he was speaking the truth. To begin in the beginning, construction on the World Trade Center began in 1966. But even before the buildings began to accept tenants as occupants in 1970, there had been a lawsuit brought against the buildings by the owners of the Empire State Building, who were apprehensive that they were going to lose tenants. This took place around 1964, but led to an inspection of the design plans and a certification that they were perfectly sound. And in fact, what we had here was an innovative design, a tube within a tube. There were 47 core columns that were the massive principal support for the building, surrounded by 240 external core columns, which were connected by steel trusses, which were welded to the core columns at one end and welded to the support columns at the other, and then filled with 4 inches of concrete on every floor. The World Trade Center actually included 7 different buildings, not just the 2 towers, which had 110 stories apiece, were the tallest buildings in the world at the time. But it also included buildings 3, 4, 5, and 6, which suffered extensive damage, as I shall explain, and a building 7, which at 47 stories would have been the tallest building in some 37 states. Now, it just so happened that a French film crew known as the Naudet brothers happened to be at a location in Midtown Manhattan, ostensibly investigating a gas leak with some firemen when the first plane hit occurred. And the film cameraman was just so adept that he was able to pan and catch it as it hit the building. It's very faint here. Rosalie Grable, also known as the Web Fairy, has done a time sequence of the images in the Naudet video, and they're very strange. She has likened this image to that of a flying pig, which in some of the frames it seems to justify that description. But I would observe that the wingspan on a 767 is even greater than the wingspan on a 757, and should have approximately covered 3/4 of the building, which at 208 feet on the side was square. Notice here, this is particularly interesting, that at the time of impact, we do not see features of the damage that should have been caused at the impact, such as this extension here of the wing. These forms of cutout to the building, in fact, look rather artificial and have sometimes been compared to cookie cutter cutouts. Here you see an amount of dust and debris from an explosion that accompanied the first hit on the North Tower, which Ace Baker, a student of these matters, has observed didn't show a kind of wing vortex, a kind of distribution of dust or debris in the air that's typical of a plane in flight. Here is Flight 1